So continuing
Right.
what you were saying about attraction
Yes.
being rooted in status, to continue your metaphor of a young
Right.
woman wearing a Columbia cap.
Right.
I mean, there's an almost in not just unconscious. There's a subtle way in which I've noticed that I can tell Columbia students apart from non. Well, it's very obvious to me when there's someone who's a non-Columbia person walking through through the campus, and they're of a perceived lower stature. And this sounds very very elitist, but it is very elitist. And my reaction to them is different, which is interesting, and it says a lot about me, of course, in this context. Nevertheless, that's a very powerful insight.
But
right?
it's not just you. I mean, think about this.
Yeah.
What if I said to you, yesterday, this young girl was brutally murdered. She was a Columbia student, and I mean, it'd be a huge shock.
Right.
Right? We would be shook to our core. Now, what if I said to you, there was another girl who was murdered yesterday. She was a prostitute. She was an immigrant. She was addicted to drugs. I mean, of course, we'd have some human sympathy, but we wouldn't feel that shock. Part of it would say, well, that's really bad, but she kind of is from that underworld where violence is the way of life, and she was a drug addict, and probably she hadn't been a drug addict.
So intuitively, I kind of sense that there's something like this going on when I think about, for instance, to extend your example to the case of the Rohingya. Our reaction to the response to the incredible brutality that's being inflicted on the Rohingya is not the same as our response as Muslims to the violence inflicted on Palestinians. Right? You know what I mean? And there are political reasons to this, but it's almost as if I sort of have a not so politically correct commentary on this, which is the Rohingya are just kind of dark. They're not as attractive as young Palestinian women. For instance, the Palestinian woman, young girl who made the headlines was her video that was shared, that I heard of. I didn't watch it myself. That it shows her apparently from childhood up until her teenage years, where she's resisting Israeli occupation, throwing blocks and things like this. And she causes a massive shockwave around the world, not least of all amongst non-Arab Israelis, because she's blonde. So the sense that she's one of us, like in terms of status, and which perhaps also all of which is also what you're saying is a commentary on why it is that Muslims comment about Muslims complain about this point, which is that. Why is it that when white Europeans die in tragic circumstances, whether from terrorist attacks or whatever, let's say terrorist attacks, then there's so much sort of news coverage of this, but when similar, if not worse, attacks happen in Muslim countries, then the response is not the same. So there's some sort of unconscious status thing going on, in addition to the active political cynical moves that are happening.
But what I want to emphasize is that it's not just or even primarily a racial thing.
You say it's a status thing.
Of course, it's a status thing. Because
which is fascinating.
Now, if you look at any pre-modern law, if you need, when they set forth compensation for manslaughter, and this includes Islamic law, right? Women are normally, there's less compensation given out for women than for men. And of course, many Islamophobes use this as an excuse to say, look, this is a clear, quantifiable example of how Muslims thought of women as being less valuable than men. But we do this even in American law. If somebody, for instance, this has happened. You had, I think it was Toyota, you had a major car manufacturing company. They realized they had a defect in their ignition. And in order to do the recall, it would have cost billions of dollars. It would have been a huge loss. They actually sat down and they calculated how much would they lose if they were sued for wrongful death versus how much it would cost to do a recall.
Mm-hmm.
So it would actually cost less money for them to let people die.
Yeah.
And they did that. Now, what this is predicated on is that in the United States, if there's wrongful death in a case like this,
Mm-hmm.
the amount of money paid out is based on the projected income.
Wow.
So if the person is some factory worker,
yeah.
the payout for manslaughter is much less than the CEO of some company.
And this is considered obviously legal and just.
This is a
legal.
basic aspect of modern
Wow.
modern law in capitalist countries. So we do it no less. We assign a numerical value to people's lives based on their social status. And now China is doing very explicitly with this credit scoring system.
Yeah.
And I saw a video just today where there was a woman who was doing an announcement over a public train saying, if you behave yourself badly, we will report you and your credit score will be lowered.
Right.
So now this is the nature of capitalism, is about quantifying. Capitalism is a system that seeks to quantify everything. That is
by everything we mean literally. I mean, its end goal is perhaps literally everything, right?
Right. Credit score, your social value, how much you're making, the probability. You talk about how we, the probability somebody will do something. It's what is probability? Probability is very problematic. When we say there's a 50% chance Trump will win in 2020, what does that even mean? I mean, you can't redo that experiment. It's not like flipping the coin. It's either he wins or he doesn't. You can't. So what does it mean to say? So probability itself is this extremely problematic venture, and that's why there actually are different forms of statistics, such as Bayesian statistics, which is will give you a number based on your assumptions, not based on some assumed, objective measure of
based on your assumptions. What do you mean?
So, for instance, in conventional statistics, you have this problem where you say, okay, there's a 50% chance I'll flip a head if I flip a coin. Because you can flip a coin a million times, and statistically speaking, based on those experiments, we can say you're going to get a head 50% of the times. Now, the problem is that most events in life are one-off. There's a woman you're in love with, and you say, there's a 65% chance she'll say yes. Like, you're not going to do this twice. What does that mean to say 65% chance she's going to say yes? Right?
And yet, this entire, for someone who's not a specialist in these areas of thinking, it seems to me that this entire system is based on this type of thinking.
It is. This brings us back to the question of what is capitalism, and the difference between modern finance and capitalism and finance even 40 years ago. So what happens is, before 1980, what we call American capitalism, was centered on corporations, not in finance markets. Finance markets are stock market, bond market, etc. And so corporations basically were these feudal estates that didn't worry about shareholders, didn't worry about stock markets forcing them to be more efficient. And there was a sort of oblige noblesse, where they gave tenure to their workers. They would give charity to the communities they lived in. So there were inefficiencies, but there was a lot of give back. Now what happens is that whole order collapses in the late 70s for a variety of reasons I won't get into unless you want to. But what happens is now with Reagan you recenter everything around stock markets, bond markets, etc. So now we don't really have corporations in the way we had corporations before. Corporations are really just portals for finance markets. But what's happening simultaneously, and what allows for this, is before the 70s, playing the stock market and the bond market is you go by your gut. Some macho alpha male at Goldman Sachs is just playing the stock market based on his gut, right?
Right, which is based on a lot of experience and so forth.
Based on experience, okay, right. But at the end of the day, it's just his burger-fueled gut, in the words of Michael Lewis. But what changes is the Black-Scholes-Merton formula.
What's that?
Which is a formula originally to price options, which is a type of financial instrument. But basically, it's based on how to predict the success of or failure of a stock in the future. So basically, what they do is using this very advanced these three math scholars. I believe they started out as PhDs in math or physics or something, but
they often, and what I've heard, that the maths in finance markets are so complicated now that they have to have physicists will work out something.
Even physicists don't understand most of what's going on.
Wow.
So this is right. So I'll explain this. So basically, what happens is these three guys, Black, Scholes, and Merton, create this formula where you say, okay, we're going to look at the sensitivity of a stock. So we say Apple. Okay, let's suppose there's a downturn in the market. Apple might only fall by $1 or 1%, whereas everybody else is falling by 5%. So what is the sensitivity of the market? How has it performed in the past? So you create all these measures, and you can say, if markets perform in a way similar to the way they've performed the last 20 years, then I can tell you with 95% certainty Apple is going to go up by 10%. Right. Now, and it is very successful math. I mean, this is very good math, and people still use it, and it works in certain conditions. Now, this becomes wildly successful, but it creates the very seeds of financial destruction. So, suppose you're a pension fund, and you're trying to invest all these pensions to create a return. Now, you are not a hedge fund. You can't just throw your money at these risky investments.
Right.
So, people who know this math create this type of insurance. They say, our models say the stuff you want to invest in is going to go up. And maybe for you it looks risky, but I'll insure you. So you give me money, and I make sure that if you lose money, I'll give you a payout. And so for a while, they're just making crazy money. The problem is this. As long as only one or two people are doing that insurance, it's fine. But all of a sudden, you have hundreds of people providing this insurance. What happens if you have a little bit of a quake in the market? I have to sell off some of my assets in order to assure the people I'm giving insurance to that I have the capital to give them if they want a payout. But all of a sudden, it's not one guy who's doing the payout. It's hundreds, and their sell-off is creating more and more pressure. And this is what leads to what's called, there's a stock market crash in October of 1987, the biggest dip. And in simplified form, this basically is what happens with the stock market, the economic crash, 2007, 2008, is people create these complicated instruments that even the most sophisticated physicists don't understand what's going on. And, just to give you an example of how ridiculous this whole...
And it's automated.
It's partially automated, yeah.
Right.
But to give you an example of how utterly ridiculous this becomes, global GDP annually is like $20 trillion. People created these instruments called derivatives, which are these sophisticated, financial instruments that are they themselves have no value, but they're based on other assets. Their nominal global value is $60 trillion. What the hell does that mean? To have a bunch of instruments that are not based directly on any real assets, worth 3 times global wealth.
Right.
It just... So you have these instruments. So basically, they thought they understood risk. They thought they did But first of all, as long as you don't have a once-in-a-lifetime sort of hurricane to destroy everything. And second of all, they don't understand. They're creating greater correlation. If you have to create a sell-off, everybody's selling off at once.
So from a traditionally Muslim point of view, a Muslim would say, this is why interest is haram. This is why creating money from money, in principle, is not permitted. To prevent this type of global meltdown and sort of what's the word, exploitation and things like that. What's your response?
So I'll give you an example. So Muslims did have a type of derivatives instrument, and it's a agricultural future. So a future is a instrument that will be exchangeable for some asset in the future. So, for instance, what was very common among Muslims and also among other civilizations was, you're a farmer, I'm a merchant. You need money now to invest in equipment, but you don't have any money now. So I say, I'm going to give you $10,000. In return, you give me your entire crop in 9 months.
Right.
And so I have a piece of paper that entitles you to your crop. So at the moment, it's worthless, but it's a derivative. Its value is derived from the future crop you're going to give me.
Right.
Now, this is completely legitimate and it's productive because we're tied together. We're both invested in each other's success.
Right.
Now, if you look at traditional bank model, a traditional mortgage, I'm the bank, or I'm the banker giving the loan, and you're a guy living in New York City. I give you a loan, I know who you are, I know the type of community you're living in, etc.
Right.
Now, normally, I would be invested in your success. You come to me, you say, look, I'm a little bit behind. I say, that's fine. Let's find out a plan you can pay. Right. Because if you foreclose on your home, that's going to affect the value of all the other properties I'm giving a loan to. Now, what's happened with the new derivatives is, instead of the bank holding on to that mortgage, they sell it off to some hedge fund guy in Miami.
Right.
He doesn't care.
Yeah, he could care less.
And so what happened with 2007, 2008 was it unbundles the derivatives. So Islamic law is fine with derivatives as long as we're bundled together.
Right.
But that's why a warranty is perfectly legitimate in Islamic law. If I sell you a product, it becomes, it needs to be fixed. I don't know if I'm going to have to invest money to repair it for you, which should not be legitimate. But because it's bundled together and we're both invested in each other's success, I want the product to succeed, you want the product to succeed, then this is legitimate Islamically.
Right.
But once you unbundle it, and I don't care, I'm going to, I sell off the need to fix it to somebody else, and they say, I'm not going to fix it. So that is exactly, so what happens is the derivatives become so unmoored from the original service or people or assets, nobody cared or knew what was going on. And mathematically, they just had no idea what was going on.
Wow.
And absolutely, I think you can make a strong Islamic critique of what happened 10 years ago.
So this is all so fascinating, so rich. This makes me think, and because for me, I'm very interested in, have been for a long time, interested in how we conceive of the human being. What does that even mean? What does the individual mean? How do we relate to one another, and so on and so forth? And what you're saying is that from a traditional Islamic or traditional old school model of how we understand the human being, we understand it's a relational thing, right? My humanity comes out of relationships with other people and communities and so on and so forth. I'm thinking.
But I would critique that.
Okay.
Right. And as somebody who, of course, on the one hand, yes, I'm very critical of the direction that contemporary capitalism has gone in. On the other hand, I don't necessarily completely agree with this model that seeks to completely eliminate money. So, for instance, this one Japanese socialist theoretician, Kojin Karatani, for whom I have great respect, he was trying to propose a model whereby instead of money, you create sort of these credits, and it exists in a community. So if we're both living in Manhattan and I fix somebody's fridge, I get a credit, and then I can use it somewhere else in Manhattan. So it binds you to the community.
Yeah.
And so he's trying to get rid of the debilitating effects of capital that comes in and creates this concentration of power. But what we need to appreciate is that, yes, on the one hand, if you look at pre-monetary societies, they understood that debt was a social construct. It wasn't based on some objective laws of physics that you owe me $20,000 and I don't care if you have to sell off your kidney or sell off your kid into slavery, you give me that money.
Right.
In a pre-monetary society, if you're the big man of a tribe and you do something where you save my life, I know I can't repay you, so I become your follower. And there's a reciprocal relationship where you give stuff to me and I do stuff for you. Now, in some ways, this is good, but on the other hand, I'm stuck. I can never escape.
Wow.
Whereas money allows you to break free.
To have freedom.
It gives you freedom. And the fact that Islam affirmed the legitimacy of using money, not only that, it actually uses the imagery of money to talk about spirituality. Right? Who will loan to God a goodly loan?
Yeah.
Or do not sell off your soul for a paltry price. So the Quran is very comfortable
It's
talking
very capitalistic.
it's capitalist in the sense that it believes in free markets.
Yeah.
Now, this actually comes to an interesting question. Going back to my advisor's true question, is Islam capitalist?
Right.
So there's a tentative answer to that. This anthropologist, David Graeber, who doesn't do Islamic civilization specifically, but who has written about Islam in depth. And he said, one of the great questions of the field is, why didn't Muslims indigenously develop capitalism? And the idea is that capitalism was the engine which generated the wealth by which the Europeans could conquer the world.
Right.
Now, Muslims had, for their time, the most pro-market society, the most developed world economy in the world before the Europeans came along in the early modern period. So why didn't they develop themselves what we now consider modern capitalism and conquer the world? And David Graeber's tentative answer is that Muslims were so committed to the idea of a free market and so committed to the idea of actual competition, they would never countenance the creation of the corporation, which is all about monopoly power.
Wow.
Right? I mean, you think about, we think of the corporation as a natural evolution of market efficiency. The corporation is the anti-market.
Because?
Where you think, okay, East India Company, do you know why did they make money? What was their secret sauce that allowed them to become lucrative? The one thing.
Indigo? No,
not an asset.
Oh, no, I don't know.
The British government gave them a monopoly over British trade in India. Monopoly power. An outsourcing of state power.
Wow.
This isn't... You had free trade in the Indian Ocean. When the Europeans came, they tried to break up that free trade and impose tolls and taxes on people wanting to do free trade. The Muslims had been committed to free trade. The Europeans wanted to use monopoly power to build up this concentration of wealth in what became the corporation.
Well, and this is the critique that's leveled against these so-called free trade agreements.
Yes, exactly.
Because it's unidirectional, right? It's free trade, i.e., the West, certain powers, certain Western powers are free to sell their goods in these less wealthy countries, but not vice versa, right? Isn't that what often happens, or no?
Well, what's happened is, if the rules of the game favor concentrations of wealth in corporate structures, and if corporate structures are outgrowths of the colonial state, then societies which traditionally were colonial and colonialist are going to have the advantage in having already developed. Now, what's happening in countries like China is you have strong corporations, but they're backed by this very authoritarian, strong state. And so Democrats always criticize the concentration of power in corporations, but they ignore the sinister effect of concentrating power in the government. They have this belief that they can democratize it and tame it.
Right.
Conservatives or Republicans always worry about the power of government, but they are very naive about the concentration of power in corporations. But this is really the great sin of modernity, is this unprecedented concentration of power in both the nation state and in corporations. And pre-modern societies, for all their faults,
support each other, right?
did not have this concentration of power. And you look at Muslim society, it wasn't just the ruling elites, and it wasn't just the merchants. The majority of agricultural land, something like 3/4 in Egypt and I think Anatolia, were under endowments, which were used for the public good. Now, of course, people set it up so that their son or daughter would run the endowment and get a big salary. I mean, it wasn't this completely selfless. No society is completely selfless. I mean, which is, okay, whatever, fine.
Even though the Muslims oftentimes like to think that their societies were...
And you can also make the critique that it stymied innovation because, you don't want 3/4 of your economy being under an NGO. I mean, maybe it's better than what we have now, but there's going to be some inefficiencies. But there's different models. It's not just about either the state or capital or some kind of authoritarian regime. You can have more decentralized ways of organizing your economy. But this is the great sin of modernity: is this concentration of power.
This is such a fascinating, incredibly rich conversation. But we're going to have to continue this conversation because, I mean, all of this is educational for me, literally all of it, and you're just a wealth of information in this regard. Do you think you could maybe we could propose some possible how should we look ahead into the future as far as whether globally as a species, and if one speaks in more Islamic, limited
Right.
Islamic terms.
Right.
Maybe could you speak to that briefly? I mean, it's not a brief thing to address, but
We need to simplify. We have this idea that more and more sophistication is what we want.
right.
But historically, the cause of a downfall of any civilization was their structures of governance took on a life of its own and became so complicated. You look at the American legal system now. I mean, nobody understands it. Just
Really?
the American tax code is 1 million lines
Really?
of text.
Wow.
And this means how much money are we putting in? It's inefficient.
Well, so people would say, in particular technologists, and not only technologists, but some significant people, movers and shakers in the world, would say, well, it's complicated, yes, we have 1 million lines of tax code, so all we have to do is create artificially intelligent entities that are sufficiently intelligent to be able to read this and decipher it and automate things. Problem solved. What would you think about that?
No matter how sophisticated technology is, there's always going to be a problem. That problem is going to be a human problem. And you look at Facebook, and you have these guys who are the most genius coders who have ever lived. We'll look at what is Facebook's problem today. Is it coding? No. It's how do you define free speech? How do you define the boundaries of free speech? It is a human problem.
You think that's